My wife Sarah and I had it all figured out. For 6 months, the plan was locked in. Our daughter was going to be named Rose. It was a classic, beautiful name that honored my grandmother and meant the world to both of us. But the second that kid hit the light, Sarah decided to go rogue. I'd been up for 30 hours straight, running on nothing but hospital coffee and adrenaline, and I stepped out to the cafeteria for 5 minutes to grab a refill. When I got back to the room, the nurse looked at me with this big, cheerful smile and said, "Congrats on baby Jackson Sky." I deadass thought I was hallucinating. I had her repeat it, and she showed me the paperwork where Sarah had written Jackson Sky in that loopy handwriting of hers. I looked at Sarah like she'd grown a second head and asked what happened to Rose. She just shrugged and said she had an epiphany during the final contractions, that our daughter was too extraordinary for a basic name like Rose and needed something unique that would stand out. I reminded her that we'd literally told every single person we knew the baby's name was Rose. But Sarah hit me with the ultimate main character card. She carried the baby for 9 months and did the labor, so she got the final say, period. The nurse saw the tension and offered to hold the papers for 24 hours so we could hash it out, but Sarah straight up lied and told her it was already submitted electronically. When we announced the name to the fam, it was a total train wreck. My mom had to ask how to spell it 3 times and still messed it up in the group chat. Sarah's dad said it sounded like some kind of high-end allergy medication, and my sister asked if we were trolling them. Sarah got super defensive, claiming everyone was just jealous of our daughter's originality. But the reality was a mess. Sarah couldn't even keep the spelling straight herself, texting people Jackson, then Jackson, then Jackson on social media. The pediatrician's office had it misspelled 4 different ways in their system, and the insurance company literally told us it exceeded their character limit for the cards. Even the daycare was sending home forms addressed to Jackson Sky because they couldn't wrap their heads around Sarah's creative vision. Sarah just blamed everyone else for being unrefined and not appreciating modern art and naming. By the time the kid was 3 months old, I begged Sarah to change it back to something normal. She accused me of trying to erase her birth experience and destroy her maternal bond, claiming the name came to her in a spiritual vision. Fast forward to the preschool years, and it was a straight-up nightmare. Teachers gave up and just called her Jay because the pronunciation was a lost cause. Other parents looked at us like we were pretentious idiots. Sarah would literally interrupt circle time to aggressively correct the teacher's pronunciation, making other parents repeat it until they got it right. She even made our 4-year-old daughter practice spelling that disaster of a name hundreds of times. The breaking point was kindergarten. Our daughter came home in tears because the other kids told her name was stupid. Sarah told her the other kids were just bland and jealous, but when our daughter asked if she could please just be called Rose instead, Sarah grounded her for being ungrateful. That was the moment I stopped being a simp and started planning my move. I did some deep dive research into legal name changes for minors and found a loophole. One parent could petition if the other parent abandoned the child or was deemed unfit. Now, Sarah wasn't unfit, but she was about to abandon her duties for a hot minute. I played it cool and convinced Sarah she was burnt out and needed a luxury spa weekend for her mental health. I booked her a high-end resort 2 hours away, specifically across state lines, and told her I'd handle everything at home. The second her car pulled out of the driveway on Friday morning, I was at the courthouse. I filed emergency paperwork stating that Sarah had left the state and abandoned her parental duties. Technically, it was true since she was out of state at the spa. The clerk took one look at Jackson Sky on the form, caught the vibe immediately, and expedited the change as a hardship case. By Monday morning, when Sarah swiped her key card to leave the resort, our daughter's legal name had been changed to Gherkin Picklebottom. I added Picklebottom as a third name just for that extra bit of flair. Sarah found out when the school office called her, asking why the updated documentation listed the kid as Gherkin. I heard her tires screech into the driveway, and I knew the final boss had arrived. The front door slammed open, and Sarah stormed in, her face twisted and redder than a tomato. She hurled her designer purse at the wall and started screaming that I'd destroyed our daughter's identity and was being cruel and vindictive. I just sat there on the couch, cool as a cucumber, folding my hands. I told her I was just using her own logic. The parent who handles the paperwork gets the final say, and I handled the paperwork this time. Sarah was shaking, pointing a finger at me and calling me a monster. She claimed her choice was sacred because of her labor vision, but I just leaned back and told her Gherkin came from my vision, too. A vision of showing her exactly how it feels when your partner goes behind your back and betrays an agreement. She started ugly crying, mascara running down her face, but I didn't feel a single thing except pure satisfaction. Then the school bus pulled up at 3:30. I watched through the window as our daughter climbed down the steps, looking absolutely defeated, her backpack dragging on the pavement. When she walked through the door, she was already sobbing. Sarah rushed over, kneeling down and asking what happened. Our daughter wailed that her teacher couldn't figure out how to say her new name, and that the kids laughed at her even harder than before. Someone had already dubbed her Pickle Lynn, and the whole class thought it was the funniest thing ever. Sarah whipped around and screamed at me that I'd made everything a living nightmare. Suddenly, that satisfaction I felt turned into a cold stone in my gut. I looked at our daughter running to her room and slamming the door, and for the first time, I felt a massive wave of doubt about my perfect revenge. I sat there staring at my hands while Sarah paced back and forth, muttering about what an absolute low-vibe person I was. The satisfaction I'd felt just an hour ago, the high of finally getting one over on her, was straight up gone, replaced by this cold stone in my gut. I'd wanted to teach her a lesson, but listening to our daughter sob through the bedroom door made me realize I'd basically set our own house on fire just to see her get burned. I finally couldn't take the toxic atmosphere, so I retreated to my office and shut the door. I pulled out my phone and called the county clerk's office back, sitting through 5 minutes of mind-numbing hold music before a woman finally picked up. I asked her point-blank about reversing a name change. There was a long pause, and then her tone went totally cold and uncomfortable. She asked if this was about the Gherkin case from Friday. I told her it was. She said she hadn't realized this was a marital dispute when she expedited my paperwork, and if she'd known Sarah hadn't signed off, she never would have let it through. I hung up feeling like a total trash human, realizing the system I'd used for revenge was now looking at me like I was the villain. Around 6 o'clock that evening, the drama reached a fever pitch. I heard a car screech into the driveway, then another one right behind it. I looked out and saw Sarah's parents, Jason and Ramona, getting out of their SUVs. Jason looked absolutely pressed, and Ramona had her jaw set in a hard line. I opened the door before they could even knock, but Jason just pushed past me without saying a word, heading straight for the living room to find Sarah and our daughter. Ramona stopped for a second to look me in the eye, and her stare was ice cold. She told me what I'd done was straight-up psychological abuse of both Sarah and our daughter. I tried to explain that Sarah had started it, but she just held up her hand and said she didn't want to hear my excuses. Jason came back out and got right in my face, telling me that at least Jackson Sky was pronounceable, but the monstrosity I'd created was worse than anything Sarah had done because it came from pure spite. I just stood there and took it while they stayed for 2 hours, talking to Sarah in the other room while I sat in the kitchen alone. The next morning, it was my own parents' turn to drop the hammer. Sarah must have called them the night before because my dad, Christopher, asked me to step out onto the front porch for a talk. He told me he was deadass ashamed of me. He said he understood why I was mad at Sarah, but using our daughter as a weapon in a marriage war was unforgivable. He told me I'd proven I cared more about revenge than my own child. My mom, Adriana, was a bit gentler, but her words cut way deeper. She said I'd turned a bad situation into something truly terrible and that I'd hurt my daughter just to hurt my wife. I watched them drive away and felt completely hollow inside. 2 days later, the school called. It was the kindergarten teacher, Mr. Wyatt Cannon. He sounded super serious and asked to schedule an emergency meeting with both of us. He wouldn't give us the details over the phone, but he said our daughter was having emotional problems at school. We had to go in the next afternoon. Sarah and I drove in separate cars and sat in separate chairs outside the principal's office, not even making eye contact. When Principal Alice Herman called us in, she looked like she was ready to go to war. She had a pile of papers on her desk and told us point-blank that whatever was going on between us needed to stop immediately. She said our daughter had told her teacher she wished she didn't have a name at all because she was so stressed out. I started to explain that I was just making a point about Sarah's original betrayal, but Alice shut me down real quick. She said she didn't care about our marital problems. She cared that a 5-year-old was being used as a weapon. Then she dropped the bomb. If we didn't resolve this right now, she'd have to file a report with Child Services. The word CPS hit me like a punch. Sarah started sobbing, and Alice just handed her a box of tissues and waited. We left the office in total silence. Sarah peeled out of the parking lot first, and I just sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. I tried to teach Sarah a lesson, but all I'd done was put our daughter in the crosshairs of the state. I drove home and sat in the driveway until the streetlights came on, watching the sky turn dark purple. When I finally went inside, Sarah was on the couch with our daughter on her lap. Our daughter looked at me with these big, worried eyes and asked if we were still fighting. She asked why we kept changing her name and if it meant we didn't love her anymore. Sarah lost it and started crying again, and I moved to the couch to put a hand on our daughter's back, promising her we'd fix it. After we put her to bed, I suggested we just file to change the name to Rose like we'd originally agreed. But Sarah wasn't having it. She put her head in her hands and said Rose felt wrong now because so much toxic stuff had happened. I got a little pressed and asked if she was really going to let our daughter keep suffering because of her feelings. Sarah shot back, asking if I was seriously acting like I cared after what I'd done. We were right back where we started, two people too stubborn to move an inch, while our kid was caught in the middle. The next morning, my mom called again. She told me she'd already contacted a heavy-hitter family lawyer named Evan Ballard. She was paying for the consultation because she said we clearly couldn't figure this out ourselves and our daughter deserved better. When I told Sarah, she actually seemed relieved. She said maybe we needed a stranger to tell us what to do since we were so busy destroying each other. We met with Evan a few days later. He was a guy in his 50s with gray hair and zero patience for our drama. He told us to sit down and then basically dragged us for an hour. He said we'd both committed parental alienation by using the name as a weapon. He told Sarah that her unilateral decision at the hospital violated my parental rights, and he told me that my gherkin revenge was textbook alienation. He said my emergency petition was built on lies. Sarah didn't abandon the kid. She went to a spa. He warned us that a judge would likely find both names harmful and might just pick a name for us if we couldn't get it together. Then he told us the most important thing. We needed to ask our daughter what she wanted. He said her voice mattered more than our egos. We went home and sat on our daughter's bed. I asked her what name she liked best. She looked at Sarah, then at me, and whispered, Rose. She started crying and said she just wanted a normal name that teachers could say and that kids wouldn't laugh at. Sarah got up and bolted out of the room, and I stayed with our daughter until she calmed down, telling her Rose was a beautiful name and that we'd make it happen. I found Sarah on the floor of our bedroom, crying her eyes out. She said she knew she was being selfish and that our daughter's happiness mattered more than our egos. A few days later, Sarah finally agreed. She had one condition. I had to sign a legal document admitting that what I did was wrong and harmful. I told her I'd sign whatever she wanted as long as this nightmare ended. We went to Evan's office and signed a joint petition to change her name to Rose. I had to sign my name right next to a paragraph admitting I'd caused harm to my own child. It was the most humbling moment of my life. The school started calling her Rose informally while the legal stuff was pending. Our daughter came home that Friday absolutely glowing. She said her teacher told the class her name was Rose now, and a girl named Olivia told her it was a pretty name. She talked through dinner for the first time in weeks, but I could see Sarah was still struggling. She would accidentally start to say Jackson, and then catch herself, her eyes filling with tears every time. We started seeing a marriage therapist, Dr. Stewart. In our first session, she didn't hold back. She told us we both had major control issues and that the name war was just a symptom of us using our daughter to fight battles that were really about us. She said we both prioritized our own feelings of power over our daughter's well-being. It was a long road, but for the first time in a long time, we were actually talking instead of trying to win. The 3 weeks leading up to the official court date were a total fever dream. Sarah and I were basically living like ghosts in the same house, barely talking unless it was about who was picking up our daughter from school. Every time I walked into the kitchen and saw that gherkin paperwork on the counter, I felt like a straight-up clown. I tried to be as savage to prove a point, but all I did was make my kid a target for every Pickle Lynn joke in the state. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit, and Sarah wore this serious navy dress that screamed, I'm a responsible mom. Our daughter, who was finally starting to act like herself again, wore her favorite purple shirt with sparkles. We met our lawyer, Evan, outside the courthouse. He looked at us over his glasses and told us to keep our cool. He said the judge would likely talk to our daughter directly, and if we tried to coach her or pull any more main character stunts, she'd see right through us. The courtroom was smaller than I thought it'd be, with this low-key buzzing from the fluorescent lights that made my anxiety peak. The judge, this woman named Alice, looked like she'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. When our case number was called, Evan stood up to present the joint petition, but Judge Alice held up a hand and shut him down. She looked straight at my daughter and asked her what name she wanted. My daughter didn't even hesitate. She looked the judge in the eye and said, "Grace." She said she wanted a name that teachers could say and that kids wouldn't laugh at. The judge made a note, her face hardening as she turned to Sarah and me. She signed the order changing the name to Grace effective immediately, but then she absolutely dragged us. "I've been on this bench for 20 years, she said, her voice like ice. "And using a child's name as a weapon in a marital dispute is one of the cruelest things I've ever seen." She told Sarah that picking a name without my consent was wrong, and she told me that my gherkin revenge was 10 times worse. She said we'd both put our egos ahead of our kids' well-being. Then she dropped the hammer. We were both ordered to complete an 8-week parenting course focused on child-centered decision-making. She wasn't done yet. She looked at me and told me she knew my abandonment petition was built on fake info. She warned me that if I ever tried to manipulate the legal system like that again, she'd hit me with contempt charges or even jail time. We walked out of there feeling like total trash. I'd won the battle to get the name Grace, but I'd lost any high ground I thought I had. The parenting classes started a few weeks later at this bland community center. Sarah and I had to sit in folding chairs in a circle with 8 other parents who had also messed up in their own ways. The instructor, Sandra, didn't play around. She taught us frameworks for discussing disagreements without turning them into a Cold War. We had to do role-playing exercises that were high-key embarrassing, but they actually made me realize how much of our marriage was just 2 people trying to dominate each other instead of being partners. Back at home, things were slowly shifting. I watched our daughter, now legally Grace, start to thrive. She came home from school talking about new friends and how her teacher, Mr. Cannon, said Grace was a pretty name. The constant tension in her shoulders was finally gone, but Sarah was still in her feelings. I'd catch her staring at old baby photos, her eyes filling with tears because she felt like she was erasing her birth experience. One night, after Grace went to bed, Sarah locked herself in the bathroom and cried for an hour. I stood outside the door, not wanting to be a simp, but also realizing that she was genuinely mourning that vision she'd had. I didn't knock. I just sat on the floor in the hallway and waited. When she finally came out, she looked exhausted. We didn't fight. I didn't make a pickle-bottom joke. I just handed her a glass of water. In our therapy sessions with Dr. Stewart, the real work was happening. She asked Sarah point-blank why she'd felt the need to grab total control over the name in the first place. Sarah admitted that she'd felt powerless during the pregnancy and labor, like everyone was telling her what to do, and choosing Jackson Sky was her way of taking her power back. Then Dr. Stewart looked at me and asked why I felt the need to retaliate so hard. I had to admit that I felt humiliated in front of our families, and I wanted Sarah to feel as powerless as she'd made me feel. "You both used your daughter to balance the scales of your own egos," Dr. Stewart said. It was a hard pill to swallow, but she was right. We'd both been terrible parents for months. By the end of the 8th week of classes, Sarah and I were finally starting to act like a team again. We came up with a family rule and stuck it on the fridge. Any major decision affecting Grace requires both parents to agree. No exceptions. It was a constant reminder of the disaster we'd barely survived. The parenting class graduation ceremony went down in this super bland community center room with those noisy folding chairs and a table of cookies that looked home-baked but high-key tasted like cardboard. Ashley and I sat through presentations from other parents about their growth journeys, and some of it was straight up awkward. One dad was crying while talking about validating his kid's feelings, and another mom was repenting for using guilt trips as a parenting tool. When it was our turn, Sandra called us up and handed us these certificates on heavy cream paper. Ashley held hers like it was a gold medal, and I just folded mine to fit in my pocket, feeling the weight of the 8 weeks we'd put in. Sandra told us she'd seen a real shift in how we talked to each other during the sessions, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a total simp for being there. I felt like a partner. Driving home in separate cars, I thought about how that little ceremony marked the end of the Gherkin era. 2 days later, a letter from the family court showed up, and I opened it while Ashley watched from the doorway like her life depended on it. It was short and sweet. The judge acknowledged we'd finished the classes and officially satisfied the court's conditions. The last line said she hoped our family would thrive, and Ashley actually smiled when she read it. Grace's 6th birthday party was the real test. We had balloons tied to the fence and a princess cake that Grace picked out herself. Both sets of grandparents showed up, and for once, the vibe wasn't toxic. My dad helped me set up the tables while Ramona arranged the plates, and nobody, not even my sister, mentioned Brinley or Picklebottom. We sang Happy Birthday. Grace blew out 6 candles in one breath, and Ashley and I stood next to each other taking photos. When our hands brushed, she didn't flinch, and she actually smiled at me in a way that felt real. After Grace was tucked in that night, Ashley dropped a bomb on me. She sat on the couch and said she wanted us to have another baby. My first reaction was pure panic because the last time we did this, it nearly nuked our entire lives. But she said she wanted a chance to do it right, with collaboration and respect from day one. She even suggested we discuss it in therapy first instead of her just making a unilateral decision. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to make sure we weren't just clout-chasing a new beginning before we were actually ready. In our next session with Dr. Stewart, we brought up the baby idea. She asked what was prompting this, and Ashley admitted that seeing Grace thrive as Grace made her realize how much she'd let her own needs override her daughter's life. I told the doctor I was scared we'd fall back into those low-vibe patterns once the stress of a newborn hit. Dr. Stewart gave us a list of the growth we'd made: better communication, actual boundaries, and putting Grace first. Then she gave us the ultimate homework. If we wanted another kid, we had to agree on the name before conception to stop history from repeating itself. For the next month, we spent our nights at the kitchen table talking names, and it was dead-ass different this time. Ashley would suggest a name and ask my opinion instead of telling me how it was going to be. I shared my picks and actually listened when she said a name reminded her of a middle school bully. We laughed about the sizzling disaster and agreed that being unique wasn't worth making a kid's life a living hell. Eventually, we decided we weren't quite ready for a new baby yet, and that decision came easy because we finally knew how to compromise. Grace started first grade in September, and I filled out the forms with her legal name, Grace, written in bold. The school had zero record of the Pickle-Lin era, and her new teacher just saw a confident, happy kid. At our first parent-teacher conference, the teacher said Grace was a leader in the class and seemed totally secure in who she was. Ashley and I walked to the parking lot holding hands, knowing how close we'd come to permanently breaking our daughter. Before we wrapped up therapy, Dr. Stewart had us do one last thing: write letters to Grace for her to read when she's older. Ashley wrote about her vision and how she'd prioritized her own spiritual connection over Grace's reality, and she apologized for the years of struggle. I wrote about my Gherkin revenge and admitted that I'd used my own child as a weapon to hurt my wife because I was pressed and humiliated. Reading those letters out loud to each other was brutal, but it was the first time we both fully owned our trash behavior. Now, a full year later, our family is in a solid place. We still have that family rule on the fridge, right next to a drawing Grace made of all of us holding hands. Under her stick figure, she wrote her name with a huge G. And every time I see it, I remember that being right isn't nearly as important as being a dad. We're not perfect, but we're honest, and Grace is thriving because we finally stopped fighting the identity war and started being parents.